Hello and welcome to my next tutorial. So in today's topic we are going to have a look why it actually matters to have a solid starting point of your project when it comes to texturing and Lookdev. This maybe doesn't sound like a very fancy topic, but it's actually quite important that we do have in our small little pipeline between our texturing software and our Lookdev scene, that we do have there some good starting points for our materials. Otherwise, things can go very wrong. So again, this topic is not really a software specific thing. This is more like an understanding of how we can create a solid base setup for our texturing and material creation. So I'm here in Mari, but again, you can use Substance Painter. That really doesn't matter. But we are here using Mari and RenderMan and Solaris. So when you're in Mari and you're loading your first project ever, it will look somewhat like that. And I can tell you, literally all the defaults, they are as wrong as they can be. And the first thing we start here is when we have a look on our Arnold standard surface shader, the weight here is set to 0.8. That means it will only have 80% of the diffuse color here, which is simply not a value we want to work with. So we want to set this here to 1. And the next thing is we want to start with a mid-gray value, or the so-called 80% gray. And why this will make sense in just a second. So we can create here a color node. And then we can hook this up here to our diffuse color. And here we can set the color space to ACCG. And then we can simply type in here 18. Then we have an 18% gray. As we can see here in the viewport, this looks very dark. And that's because the Mari's default lights, they're actually total dog shit. So we want to turn them off altogether. We want to use the environment light. And I have here loaded already in HDR. You can load in there whatever you want. I like HDRs that are more neutral in color. Sometimes I even have HDRs they don't have color in at all. I just make them black and white. And there you can use your HDR of choice. I would probably suggest not using one that has a very strong sunlight, more use something like an indoor or studio setup or something like that. If you have Substance Painter, the Tomoko Studio is actually quite nice. That's the one I'm using here. And then we can just set it up the way how we want. So here comes a very important part, that we want to make sure that our 18% gray here in the viewport is not too bright and not too dark. So we want to have something that is actually looking exactly like that. So it depends on which HDR you're using. You might want to tweak that here slightly, maybe a bit brighter or maybe a bit darker. Be careful, this slider here is very sensitive. I don't know why Foundry is doing a slider like that where you have so much space here. I mean, yeah, it's just Mari being Mari. Bit of a cripple of a tool. So yeah, dial it now in, the light, to get a gray that looks somewhat like that. Don't change the gray color itself. We want to have a solid gray that we can trust. Also then later in our Lookdev scene. So I hope this makes sense. Tweak the light until you get something like that. What I also like to do is I like to have a roughness value here, which we can use a constant for, that is 0.55. So this is actually aiming towards those chrome ball and gray balls. They have some values like that. So this is actually exactly the midpoint, the gray point we're looking for, and also the roughness value is somewhat there. So when we are having our look, I think this is somewhat a good starting point for us. On here now we could start building our materials on top. But now we want to make sure that our Lookdev scene is set up correct as well. And in order to have there a good practice to learn this whole thing, we're going to export those two textures here, the roughness and the diffuse color. So I have here set my folder and everything. We can just export it. And if you have the latest Mari version, you can also set it here to RenderMan type. Then it's a mip-mapped XR file. I wish there would be here a little column here that is actually showing us what file type here is used, but it's not. So just double click on it, set it here, press OK, check here as well, OK, and then we are good to go. So let's export. If you're in Substance Painter, there the process is the exact same. Start with an 80% gray in a linear file format, in a linear color space, which will be ACCG. Get the roughness map out as well, and set up your light scene there, that we have something like that. So here we have in Solaris just a really basic material. This is really just a llama material where we have the specular component, where we have the diffuse component, and I'm pointing here to the textures, the roughness, and the diffuse, and that's really it. I'm loading here the exact same HDR, and then we can actually render. So let's quickly set it here to default. So no exposure, anything extra added on top. Let's render that. And there we can see it's coming already. It's a bit slow sometimes in getting the first iteration done. There we go. So when we now start comparing how bright the gray appears here when I actually fully ray trace my material compared to Mari, we see it's, I would say, very close, but it's not, it's a tiny bit darker here. So what you then can do is you can go in and just slightly increase your brightness of your HDR, that you're maybe not perfectly match your values between your texturing package and your Lookdev package. I mean, it's not going to happen anyway, since this is ray traced and the other thing is Vulkan or OpenGL or whatever you're using there. But we want to be as close as possible. So when we now compare, I would say this is very close. So why does this matter? When we now start tweaking our textures, we are sure that the brightness is set correctly. That means when we have here a scene that will be too dark in its light, let's maybe make 0.5, and now we would start matching some colors to a reference image, we would most likely make them too bright, because here we have to push it on this slider way brighter. So let's set it maybe to something like that. And now let's go back to a 1. Do you see that? So that's why it is very important that we do have in our Lookdev scene and in our texturing scene a starting point that is more normalized between the two packages, and then we can start color picking from our reference, and then by eyeball start grading it towards the values we need. And as soon as we have that, from there then it's just really iterational work. So we can go here to that, and then we can say okay, export, and here we go. We can go back here, restart render, and then it should pick up the new textures. And then we know if it would now appear too dark here in my Lookdev scene, then it's not because of the light, then it's because my textures are too dark, or if it's too bright or too saturated or whatever. We really just want to be sure that every other possibilities that are coming maybe from the light are not eliminated, but that they are not influenced by that. There is another point why the brightness of the light actually matters quite a lot. As soon as we start dealing with subsurface scattering, or where we have light penetrating the surface, there, if your light is too bright, you most likely are going to tweak your subsurface scattering values differently compared to when it's maybe too dark, or set just in the sweet spot where we get a reasonable mid-gray value. So I hope this actually makes sense, and I hope this does illustrate why it is important to have a good communication between your texturing package and your Lookdev setup, and why we do need to have there a solid foundation to build our materials on top. So one thing which I also just want to mention is this is now tweaked based on a studio indoor setup. So when you have a scene that is in the bright sunny daylight, there your gray will look most likely a bit brighter than what I just had here. Or if you have a very dark scene, there it will of course appear darker. But then we know why it is like that. So it's on purpose darker or brighter. But I always recommend to have, at least in your texturing package, light setup that is neutral. I like to have there, set as a neutral indoor studio setup, or a more neutral HDR that is not giving me too harsh shadows or lights. And in my Lookdev scene, I also like to have at least one such light rig that I can check where is everything kind of like in such a neutral environment. And from there, then I can also load an HDR image or a light setup that is a very bright outdoor scene or a very dark night scene in the forest or something like that. And then I can always cross compare how is my material behaving, how are my textures behaving in those different lighting scenarios. So yeah, I hope this was actually learnful for you, and we'll see you in the next tutorial. Bye bye.